The Arizona sun burned low on the horizon, bleeding molten orange across the desert sky. Long shadows stretched over the rocky ridges, swallowing the sparse cactus groves and dry mesquite trees in pools of darkness. The air was heavy, dry, and quiet, the kind of quiet that made a man's own heartbeat sound too loud in his ears. Ethan Cole rode slowly along the narrow creek bed, his hat pulled low, reins loose in his hand. His horse, a dusty gray Mustang named Smoke, stepped carefully on the uneven rocks, the soft jingle of spurs the only sound cutting through the silence. He'd been out since morning, riding the fence line of his ranch, patching breaks where wandering cattle had pushed through. It was lonely work, but Ethan had grown used to the silence. Loneliness had become his companion over the years, easier to bear than heartbreak. The desert wind carried whispers of the past, though he tried not to listen. He'd buried his wife Clara and their unborn child 5 years ago after an Apache raid turned their little cabin into smoldering ash. Folks in town had expected Ethan to join the lynch mobs after that, to let hate eat away at him like it did to so many. But he hadn't. Instead, he'd withdrawn, built a new ranch miles away from town, and kept to himself. He didn't join the angry men spitting curses over whiskey. He didn't ride with the posses that hunted Apaches through the hills. He kept his head down, tending his cattle, mending fences, fixing saddles, and sleeping under the stars when he couldn't face the empty bed. But sometimes, no matter how far you ran from your past, it found you anyway. That evening, Ethan noticed the vultures first. Black silhouettes wheeling lazily against the amber sky. He narrowed his eyes beneath the brim of his hat. Out here, vultures meant death. An animal, maybe, or worse. He urged Smoke forward, nudging the horse into a careful trot as the creek bed narrowed into a rocky gorge. The closer he rode, the stronger the stench hit him, the unmistakable smell of blood and sunburnt flesh. Ethan's hand instinctively dropped to the worn handle of his Colt .45 resting in its holster. The desert didn't forgive carelessness, and then he saw her, flash of pale buckskin against the dark trunk of a twisted mesquite tree. At first, he thought it was just another carcass left behind by raiders, maybe a deer or cow strung up by scavengers. But as he drew nearer, his chest tightened. It wasn't an animal. It was a girl, a young Apache girl no more than 16, hung by her wrists from a low branch, her bare feet barely brushing the dust below. Her long black hair clung to her blood-matted cheeks, and purple bruises ringed her neck and arms where the rope bit into her skin. Around her neck dangled a crude wooden sign, roughly carved with jagged letters, "White Man Don't Forgive." Ethan froze. For a long moment, all he could hear was the slow rasp of his own breathing and the distant caw of the vultures overhead. He scanned the surrounding ridges, every muscle taut, expecting rifles to gleam in the waning light or horses to thunder down on him. But there was no one. Whoever had done this was long gone. Ethan swung off his horse and approached cautiously, Colt in hand. The girl stirred faintly, a soft, broken whimper escaping cracked lips. "Easy now," he muttered, voice low, rough from disuse. She was alive. Barely. Ethan sheathed the Colt and reached up, sawing at the rope with his hunting knife. The fibers gave way, and she collapsed against him, a fragile weight in his arms. "Damn," he whispered under his breath, feeling the shallow rise and fall of her chest. She was little more than skin and bones. Her lips moved, trembling around words he couldn't understand. Apache words. "A prayer, maybe." He said softly, cradling her head. "Ain't no one gonna hurt you now." He glanced back at the sign still swinging gently from its cord. The words weren't just meant for her. They were meant for anyone who found her. A warning. A threat. And suddenly Ethan understood the danger he was in. If the townsfolk found him here with an Apache girl, he'd be branded a sympathizer. Worse, if her people saw him carrying her, they might think he was the one who hurt her. Every choice led to blood. For a moment, he considered leaving her, walking away, letting the desert take her so she could rest, and so he wouldn't have to choose. But when her small hand clutched weakly at his shirt, clinging to life with whatever strength she had left, Ethan knew he couldn't. "All right," he muttered, more to himself than her. "You're coming with me." He lifted her gently and carried her to Smoke, settling her across the saddle before mounting behind her. With one arm steadying her and the other holding the reins, he turned his horse toward the west, back toward his isolated ranch. The vultures watched him go, circling wider now, disappointed by the meal stolen from them. As he rode, the fading sun bled into deep purples and bruised blues across the desert sky. Coyotes began to howl in the distance, and somewhere far off, a lone wolf answered. The girl shifted faintly, a soft moan escaping her lips, but she didn't wake. Ethan's jaw tightened. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know why someone wanted her dead. But he knew one thing for certain. Whoever hung her up like that wasn't done yet, and by taking her, he'd just stepped straight into the middle of someone else's war. The night had settled over the desert by the time Ethan Cole rode back to his ranch, carrying the frail Apache girl in his arms. The stars glittered sharp and cold above him, scattered like spilled diamonds across a sea of black velvet. The air had grown cooler, but Ethan's shirt clung damp to his back, soaked in both sweat and fear. Every creak of his saddle and distant rustle of brush made his hand twitch toward the Colt at his side. He wasn't just riding through the desert anymore. He was riding into trouble he didn't fully understand. The girl's weight against his chest was almost nothing, like holding a bird with broken wings. Her shallow breaths were ragged and uneven, her skin hot with fever. The sign that had dangled around her neck, "White man don't forgive," haunted his thoughts, burned behind his eyes. Whoever had strung her up like that wanted blood. Spilled. They wanted revenge, chaos. Maybe even war. By the time he reached his ranch, the moon had climbed high, bathing the land in ghostly silver. Ethan dismounted carefully, lifting the girl down and carrying her inside the small cabin he called home. He laid her gently on the narrow bed in the corner, her dark hair spilling like ink across the rough wool blanket. Smoke, his gray Mustang, snorted outside, restless as if sensing Ethan's unease. He lit a lantern, its warm glow pushing back the darkness, and fetched a basin of water from the barrel near the door. Dipping a rag, he began cleaning the blood and dirt from her face and arms. Every bruise he uncovered made his jaw tighten. Whoever had done this hadn't just wanted her dead. They'd wanted her to suffer first. When he finally cut away the rope, burns on her wrists and neck. She stirred faintly, her eyelids fluttering open for the briefest moment. Her gaze was hazy, full of confusion and fear, but she whispered something soft, a string of Apache words Ethan couldn't understand. Before slipping back into unconsciousness, he sat back on the edge of the bed, rubbing a hand over his tired face. He hadn't been this close to an Apache since the night Clara died. He still remembered the smoke, the screams, the crack of rifles. And yet, sitting here now, looking at this girl, bruised, beaten, left to die, he didn't feel hatred. He just felt hollow. For hours, Ethan worked in silence, tending her wounds, wetting her lips with water, wrapping her thin body in a spare blanket. The night grew deep and quiet, but his mind refused to rest. Helping her was a dangerous choice. And he knew it. The settlers in town were already on edge. Every raid, every missing cow, every gunshot in the distance was blamed on the Apache. Ethan had overheard whispers the last time he went into Silver Creek for supplies, whispers of lynchings, patrols and bounty hunters offering payment for Apache scalps. If anyone found out she was here, Ethan stood and paced across the cabin, boots creaking against the wooden floor. He could take her into town, drop her off at the sheriff's office, and wash his hands of the whole mess. That would be the smart thing to do. But deep down, he already knew what would happen if he did. They'd hang her in the square, same as they tried to do before, and no one would lose a night's sleep over it. And if he tried to send her back to her people, that might be worse. Her tribe would see her wounds, see him with her, and assume he was responsible. He'd be dead before he could explain it was a trap either way. Damn it. Cole, he muttered under his breath, staring at the dying embers in the stove. What the hell did you just get yourself into? Just before dawn, the girl stirred again, groaning softly. Ethan knelt beside her, offering a small tin cup of water. This time, she managed to drink. Her voice was hoarse when she finally spoke. A single word, Ayoka. He realized it was her name. Ayoka, he repeated quietly, testing the sound of it. All right, then. You rest, Ayoka. You're safe here. Safe. The word tasted like a lie on his tongue. As the sun rose over the desert, spilling gold across the horizon. Ethan saddled Smoke again and rode to a nearby canyon to check his water troughs. He needed time to think, away from the cabin. But the desert wasn't giving him peace today. He noticed fresh horse tracks near the edge of his property. Multiple riders, heavy boots, and wagon ruts. Someone had been close. When he returned to the ranch, Ayoka was still asleep, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. He checked his rifle, loaded his revolver, and shut the cabin shutters tight. That evening, he rode into Silver Creek for supplies. The town was buzzing with tension. Men gathered outside the saloon in small knots, voices low but urgent. He caught fragments of their talk. Bounty hunters, burned homesteads, Apache trouble. Inside the general store, Martha Gaines, the shopkeeper's wife, leaned close and whispered, "Word is, a couple of savages were caught spying near Miller's Crossing. One's dead. The other, well, they say she didn't make it far." Ethan kept his face neutral, nodding absently as he paid for bandages, more water, and dried meat. But his heart hammered in his chest. They were looking for Ayoka as he left town. Ethan spotted Caleb Rowe leaning against a post near the saloon, a smirk curling beneath his rough beard. Caleb was a bounty hunter, the kind of man who'd shoot a child if someone paid him enough. His cold blue eyes followed Ethan, like a rattlesnake watching prey. "Cole," Caleb drawled, tipping his hat. "Word is, one of them Apache brats slipped the noose. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Ethan kept his voice steady. "Ain't my business, Roe." Caleb's grin widened, sharp and knowing. "Well, you know what they say, white man don't forgive." The words struck Ethan like a physical blow, the echo of that sign hanging from the tree searing fresh in his mind. That night, back at the ranch, Ethan sat by the window, rifle resting across his knees, watching the desert for shadows that moved wrong. Ayoka slept fitfully, murmuring in her native tongue, flinching at nightmares only she could see. He wanted to believe he could keep her safe here. But deep down, he knew better. Somewhere out there, men like Caleb were hunting her. Somewhere out there, her people might already believe a white man had hurt her, and Ethan Cole had just placed himself squarely in the middle of both fires. The line between right and wrong blurred under the weight of the choice he'd made. And as the wind howled across the barren desert, carrying with it the faint, distant cry of a coyote, Ethan realized something chilling. Saving Ayoka hadn't just put his life at risk. It had lit a fuse that could set the whole territory on fire. The days that followed were a blur of restless nights and quiet tension. Ethan Cole woke each morning before sunrise, his ears trained to catch the slightest sound outside the cabin. The crunch of boots, the whinny of unfamiliar horses, the creak of saddles in the distance. Trouble was circling, and he could feel it in his bones like the prickle of a coming storm. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and medicine. Ayoka's fever came and went in waves, her frail body fighting to heal. Ethan kept her hidden from the world, shuttering the windows tight and warning her not to make a sound whenever riders passed too close to the ranch. He wasn't used to sharing his space with anyone anymore. After Clara's death, he'd built walls around himself thicker than stone. But having Ayoka there, silent, fragile, yet burning with a quiet strength, unsettled something deep inside him. Some nights, when the fever took hold, she'd whisper names in her native tongue, soft and broken, as though calling to ghosts only she could see. One night, Ethan caught a single English word among them, Dakota. The next morning, when she was lucid enough to speak, he asked gently, "Dakota? That your brother?" Ayoka hesitated, eyes flicking to his, as if weighing whether to trust him. Finally, she nodded, her voice raspy from disuse. "They kill Dakota, white hunters, say, we spy." Ethan felt the weight of her words settle like lead in his chest. He thought of the sign around her neck. White man don't forgive. Whoever had killed Dakota wanted more than revenge. They wanted war. He crouched beside her, keeping his voice low and calm. "You ain't safe out here, Ayoka. Those men'll be looking to finish what they started. But I ain't about to hand you over." Her dark eyes searched his face, still wary, but he caught the faintest flicker of something there. Relief. Maybe even gratitude. Later that day, Ethan saddled Smoke and rode into the hills to check the Northridge fence line, leaving Ayoka hidden beneath the cabin floorboards, a crude hiding space he'd carved years ago to stash money and rifles. As he crested the ridge, he spotted a thin spiral of smoke curling up from the valley beyond through his spyglass. He saw a campsite, 4 men, rough-looking, armed heavy. Among them, he recognized Caleb Rowe instantly, lounging against him. Saddled like a man who owned the land beneath him. Ethan's gut twisted. Caleb had found something. Maybe the trail, maybe rumors. Either way, it wouldn't be long before they came knocking on his door. When he returned to the ranch, he found Ayoka crouched by the window, peeking through a narrow crack in the shutters. Her gaze fixed on the horizon where distant riders kicked up dust. "They come," she whispered, voice trembling. Ethan cursed under his breath, pulling the shutters closed and checking his rifle. "We ain't giving 'em reason to think you're here. You stay quiet. Stay low. You hear me?" That night, they ate in silence, the small cabin lit by a single oil lamp. Ethan noticed how Ayoka's hand still shook when she held the tin cup of water, but her eyes burned fierce beneath the bruises. She wasn't weak. She was surviving. As the hours stretched on, the quiet between them shifted. It wasn't comfortable, not yet, but it wasn't as sharp-edged as before either. Ethan found himself telling her things he hadn't said aloud in years, about Clara, about the night of the raid, about the silence that had swallowed him whole afterward. Ayoka listened without interruption, her gaze steady, and when he finally fell quiet, she murmured softly in broken English, "Hate, make man blind. You see." The words struck deeper than he expected. The following morning, Sheriff Ben Harper rode up to the ranch, dust cloud trailing behind him. Ethan stepped out onto the porch, rifle resting casually against the doorframe, trying to look as if nothing was amiss. Ben tipped his hat, his weathered face lined with worry. "Mornin', Cole. Got something we need to talk about." Ethan nodded slowly. "Reckon I figured as much." The sheriff dismounted, tying his horse to the post. "Caleb Rowe and his lot are riled up down in town. They're saying an Apache girl escaped lynching out near Miller's Crossing. Dead brother, burned wagons, the whole works. They're stirring folks up something fierce. Ethan kept his face unreadable. Ain't my affair, Ben. Ben narrowed his eyes. Ain't it, though? Folks are whispering your name. Rose says he saw you ridden west the same night that girl disappeared. A long silence stretched between them, heavy as wet rope. Finally, Ethan said evenly, I keep to my own, Ben. Always have. The sheriff sighed, rubbing at his neck. I know you, Ethan, but Rose poisoning ears faster than I can shut him up. You'd best be careful. After Ben rode off, Ethan lingered on the porch, watching the dust settle in the fading light. He felt the walls closing in around him. Inside, Ayoka sat cross-legged on the bed, watching him silently. White men, she said softly, struggling with the words. They hunt me. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, meeting her gaze. Not just you, Ayoka. They're hunting anyone gives them reason. And right now, you being alive? That's all the reason they need. She hesitated, then spoke with quiet determination. I go. You safe. He shook his head firmly. Ain't happening. You leave now, you won't make it past the foothills. You're staying. Least till I figure something better. For the first time since he'd cut her down from that tree, she didn't argue. She simply nodded, trusting him in a way that startled him more than he cared to admit. But trust was a dangerous thing out here. That night, as a dry wind howled across the desert, Ethan lay awake listening to the creak of the old cabin and the distant cries of coyotes. He couldn't shake the feeling that the noose was tightening, not just around Ayoka's neck this time, but around his too, somewhere. Out there, Caleb Rowe and his men were hunting, and if they didn't find her soon, they'd bring hell to his doorstep to smoke her out. The desert sun was merciless the next day, burning high and bright, bleaching the land into harsh tones of gold and white. Heat waves shimmered across the distant ridges, twisting the horizon into a restless mirage. Even the wind had stilled, as though the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Ethan Cole stood on the porch of his cabin, arms folded, staring across the dusty expanse of his ranch. His cattle grazed lazily in the far field, their shadows stretching long under the rising sun. But Ethan's thoughts were miles away. He could feel trouble circling like vultures overhead. Caleb Rowe wasn't the kind of man to let go once he sank his teeth into something. Ethan knew the bounty hunter's type, ruthless, charming when he needed to be, but vicious when crossed. If Rowe suspected Ethan was hiding Ayoka, he wouldn't hesitate to burn the ranch to the ground and hang Ethan alongside her. Inside the cabin, Ayoka sat cross-legged on the floor, her hands resting on her knees, head bowed slightly as she hummed a soft, low tune in her native language. The sound was haunting, a melody full of grief and longing. Ethan paused at the doorway, listening, struck by how fragile yet steady her voice was despite everything she'd endured. But the peace didn't last. By midday, a dust cloud rose from the east, and soon after, riders came into view, 3. Men on horseback, rifles slung across their backs. Ethan tensed, hand instinctively resting on the worn handle of his Colt. He stepped down from the porch slowly, every muscle coiled tight. The lead rider was Sheriff Ben Harper. The other 2 were townsfolk Ethan vaguely recognized, ranch hands from the south pasture, their faces grim. Cole, Ben called as he reined in his horse. We need a word. Ethan glanced back at the cabin, where the shutters were drawn tight. He forced his voice to stay calm. What's going on? Ben removed his hat, wiping sweat from his brow. Town's boiling over. Caleb rose. Been talking loud about Apache raiders, claiming they're hiding spies among us. Says there's proof a girl got away from the lynch-in at Miller's Crossing. He's gathering men. Ethan's jaw tightened. Sounds like Caleb's stirring up trouble again. Ben's gaze sharpened, searching Ethan's face. Trouble's exactly what we don't need right now. Folks are scared, Ethan. Scared men make stupid choices. If that girl's out there, she needs to be found before Ro convinces everyone to start shooting at shadows. Ethan forced himself to shrug, feigning indifference. Ain't seen no girl. Ben studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded, pulling his hat back on. You keep your head down, Cole. Times like these, Stan. Neutral can get a man killed. The riders turned and disappeared into the shimmering heat, leaving Ethan standing in the dust, sweat dripping down his temple. Inside the cabin, Ayoka emerged from the shadows, her dark eyes wide, questioning. They? No? She asked softly. Not yet, Ethan said, setting his rifle down on the table, but Ro's close, too close. That night, Silver Creek was alive with tension. Ethan rode into town under cover of darkness, needing supplies and hoping to overhear what Ro was planning. The saloon was packed, men gathered around tables thick with smoke and whiskey. Laughter was scarce, replaced by low, sharp whispers and the scrape of boots on wooden floors. Ethan slid into the corner, ordering a glass of water while keeping his hat low dot from across the room. He spotted Caleb Rowe standing near the bar, charming a small group of ranchers with his easy smile and silver tongue. Ethan edged closer, pretending to study the bulletin board as Rowe's words carried over the din. Apache devil's been sneaking into our lands, burning cattle, talking supplies, Rowe said, his voice smooth, confident. We caught one of their spies, strung her up as a warning. But someone cut her down. The men muttered darkly. Fists tightening around their drinks. Rowe leaned in, lowering his voice just enough to make them strain to hear. Word is, she's been seen heading west. Now, I ain't saying Ethan Cole's hiding her. He let the words hang, letting suspicion bloom on its own. But a man who spends that much time alone, away from town, makes you wonder whose side he's on. Ethan's fists clenched at his sides, nails biting into his palms. He forced himself to stay put, not rise to the bait. Back at the ranch, Ayoka sat by the small fire, her fingers working quickly over a strip of leather, braiding it with delicate precision. She'd been quiet all evening, but when Ethan returned, she finally spoke. White men. Fight Apache soon, she said softly, without looking up. He removed his hat, running a hand through his damp hair. Not if I can help it. Ayoka shook her head, her voice low but certain. Too late. Blood already spilled. More come. Ethan sat heavily on the edge of the bed, staring into the fire. You're right about one thing, he said finally. Ro wants a war, and if we don't stop him, he'll get one. For the first time, Ayoka looked directly at him, her gaze steady and fierce. Then we stop him. Ethan studied her, seeing the fire beneath her quiet exterior. She wasn't just a frightened girl hiding from hunters. She was a survivor, and she had reasons of her own to fight back. The following days blurred into a tense rhythm. Ethan kept the shutters closed, the rifle loaded, and Ayoka hidden whenever riders passed. Twice, he spotted strangers scouring the hills beyond his property, their silhouettes sharp against the setting sun. On the third day, Ben returned alone, his face grim. Ro's gathering 10 men, the sheriff said without preamble. They're ridden out tomorrow, Cole. Gonna start searching every ranch west of Silver Creek. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Then they'll find her. Ben hesitated, lowering his voice. I ain't asking questions, I don't want answers. T.O. But if you're tangled in this somehow, Ethan, you best figure a way out before it's too late. When Ben rode off, Ethan returned inside, slamming the door behind him. They'll come tomorrow, he said. Ayoka's expression didn't change, though her fingers tightened on the leather strip she'd been braiding. Then, she said quietly, we go tonight. Ethan shook his head. They'll expect that. No, we stay put. I'll hide you deep. Let 'em search the place if they want. They won't find nothin'. But deep down he wasn't so sure. Caleb Bro wasn't a man who stopped looking. Once he smelled blood. That night, Ethan sat awake, rifle across his lap, listening to the wind whistle through the desert scrub. Ayoka slept curled beneath a blanket in the narrow space beneath the floorboards. Hidden like a secret the world wasn't ready to hear. In the distance, coyotes yipped under the pale glow of the moon. Somewhere beyond the hills, a different kind of predator was preparing to hunt. By the time dawn touched the horizon, Ethan knew one thing with bone-deep certainty. There was no going back. He'd made his choice the moment he cut Ayoka down from that tree. Now, the whole desert would bleed for it. The sun was beginning to bleed into the horizon, painting the desert sky with streaks of crimson and gold as Jacob Ryder rode back toward the ranch, his heart heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. Each hoofbeat of his chestnut stallion seemed to echo the questions hammering inside his mind. The warning carved into that tree still haunted him. White man don't forgive. And now, after the events of the past few days, he feared that those words were less a warning and more a prophecy. The Apache camp lay silent behind him, but its silence was deceptive, like the stillness before a storm. He'd spent hours among the elders, trying to negotiate peace, trying to convince them that not every white man came with guns and hatred. He wanted to believe they'd listened. But their eyes, sharp as arrowheads, had told him something else entirely. They respected him, yes, but forgiveness was a river that no longer flowed. When Jacob reached the ranch, Elena, the young Apache girl he'd rescued, was sitting by the corral fence, braiding a strand of horsehair into a bracelet. Her once broken spirit had begun to mend, but her haunted eyes still carried shadows of fear. The sight of him made her rise immediately, scanning his face for answers. "You talk to them," she said softly, her accent wrapping around each word like desert wind. "What did they say?" Jacob dismounted slowly, his boots crunching against the dry earth. "They'll protect you," he said, forcing steadiness into his voice. "But they also want blood for blood." Elena froze, her fingers tightening around the bracelet. "Whose blood?" Jacob hesitated. He didn't want to tell her, but the truth had a way of clawing its way out. "The men who did this to you. The ones who hung you up there with that damn sign. The Apache want them dead." For a moment, Elena said nothing. Her dark eyes stared at the setting sun, her breathing ragged. Finally, she whispered, "And if they don't find them?" Jacob looked away, jaw tightening. "Then they'll come for all of us." Inside the ranch house, the air was thick with tension. The old wooden walls, usually filled with a gentle hum of quiet evenings, now seemed to trap every uneasy thought. Jacob's foreman, Walt Hanley, leaned against the doorway, arms folded, his grizzled face lined with worry. "You're staring up a hornet's nest, Ryder," Walt said in a low growl. "Ain't our fight. Best thing we can do is hand the girl over, let her people deal with it." Jacob spun on him, fury flashing in his storm-gray eyes. "She's not theirs to take. She came to us broken, half dead, hung in from a tree because some bastard thought his hatred gave him the right to play God. I'm not handing her back to anyone." Walt shook his head. "Then you better saddle up for hell, because it's ridden our way." That night, Jacob barely slept. He sat on the porch, rifle across his knees, watching the stars blink faintly above the desert. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries carrying a strange sadness that mirrored his own thoughts. He thought about his father, a man who'd taught him that justice wasn't just about punishing wrongs, it was about doing right, when no one else would, but the world had changed since then. Out here, justice didn't ride with a badge. It came at the end of a barrel. The next morning brought trouble. Dust rose on the horizon, 3 riders approaching fast, the glint of their rifles catching the early sunlight. Jacob recognized them instantly. Cole Tanner and his brothers, outlaws notorious for their hatred of the Apache. Rumor had it they were the ones responsible for hanging Elena with that damn sign, and judging by the cold smirks on their faces, the rumors were true. Jacob stepped into the yard, his hand resting casually near his Colt, his voice steady. "Turn around, Cole. You ain't welcome here." Cole Tanner spat into the dirt, his pale blue eyes gleaming with cruelty. "Ain't come for you, Ryder. Came for the girl." Jacob's body tensed like a coiled rattler. "She stays." Cole grinned, tilting his head mockingly. "Thought you were smarter than this, rancher. That girl's a mark. You keep her, you're inviting death from her people and ours. Ain't worth it." Jacob stepped closer, his boots grinding into the dust. "You strung her up like an animal, Tanner. You want to finish what you started, you'll have to go through me." For a moment, the yard held its breath. Then Cole laughed, a low, ugly sound. "Fine, but when the Apaches come, and they will come, don't say we didn't warn ya." They rode off, leaving behind a trail of swirling dust and a promise of bloodshed. That evening, Elena found Jacob by the barn, sharpening his knife beneath the fading light. "Why do you protect me?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling like a fragile string. Jacob paused, lifting his gaze to meet hers. "Because someone should have done the same for my little sister." He didn't say more. He didn't need to. Elena understood. In that single sentence, he'd given her the piece of his past he kept locked away from everyone else. But even as a bond formed between them, danger crept closer. 2 days later, smoke rose from the northern ridge. Apache war signals. The Tanners had slaughtered an Apache hunting party, knowing it would ignite vengeance. Now, the full weight of that fury was rolling toward Jacob's land like a thunderstorm by nightfall. They were surrounded. Flames from their torches cast shadows across the ranch yard as Apache warriors circled silently, their painted faces glowing in the firelight. Elena stood trembling beside Jacob. Torn between fear for him and sorrow for her people, an elder stepped forward, his weathered face marked by lines of grief and anger. "Give us the Tanners," he demanded in Apache, his voice carrying like a drumbeat. Jacob shook his head slowly. "They're long gone," he replied, his words firm but respectful. The elder's gaze darkened. "Then you will pay their debt." Before Jacob could respond, a single arrow thudded into the dirt at his feet. The message was clear. They weren't leaving without blood. The ranch became a battlefield. Gunfire cracked through the night, mingling with war cries and the pounding of hooves. Jacob fought like a man possessed, his rifle spitting fire, but there were too many. Sparks flew as arrows struck the barn, igniting dry hay. Horses screamed, their wild panic adding chaos to the storm. Through the smoke and noise, Jacob caught glimpses of Elena, her small frame darting between shadows, trying to help the wounded and drag water from the well. She moved like a spirit of the desert. Terrified yet unbroken. At one point, he spotted Walt fall, an arrow lodged in his shoulder. Without thinking, Jacob sprinted across open ground, hauling the old foreman to safety even as bullets and arrows ripped the air around them. By dawn, the yard was littered with spent shells, splintered wood, and blood. The Apaches had withdrawn, but Jacob knew they'd be back. The first clash was over, but the war had only begun. Standing on the porch, Jacob wiped the soot and blood from his face. Elena came to stand beside him, her expression unreadable. "They will not stop," she whispered. Jacob nodded grimly, his jaw set like stone. "Then neither will I." Behind them, the ranch smoldered. Ahead, a new day rose over the desert, red as spilled blood. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the Tanners were riding free, unaware that their sins had set fire to the land. Jacob knew one thing for certain. Before this was over, someone's hands would be stained forever. The sun dipped low behind the jagged peaks, bleeding gold and crimson into the wide Arizona sky, casting long shadows across the lonely trails where silence seemed thicker than dust. Ethan Cole, the once lonely rancher who had been thrust into a storm far bigger than himself, rode slowly alongside Ayoka, the young Apache girl he had saved from the tree. The memory of her hanging there, fragile, broken, barely alive, still haunted his nights. But what haunted him more was the reality he now faced. A war was brewing, and somehow he had been dragged to the heart of it. The bitter feud between the settlers and the Apache tribes had escalated. After the attack on a nearby homestead where 3 men were killed and a barn burned to ash, the town of Deadwood Creek was on edge. Men whispered about vengeance over whiskey glasses, rifles were polished late into the night, and angry voices rose in the saloon demanding the army's intervention. On the other side, Ayoka's tribe, led by her uncle Tahoma, prepared for retaliation. The settlers blamed the Apache for every crime. The Apache blamed the settlers for every trespass. And Ethan? He stood caught between 2 worlds, one that saw him as a brother and another that saw him as a traitor. They had spent days traveling into the high desert, following Tahoma's men toward an ancient meeting ground. The air here smelled different, sharp with sagebrush and distant rain. Ayoka rode silently, her long braids swaying softly, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon. She trusted Ethan now more than she had ever trusted a white man before. But even trust felt fragile when every whisper in the wind promised blood. "You shouldn't have come," she said finally, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft but laced with fear. Ethan glanced at her, adjusting his hat. "I ain't letting you walk into this alone, kid. If there's gonna be talk of peace, I am to be there." "Peace?" Ayoka's voice cracked, and she gave a bitter laugh. "There will be no peace, Ethan Cole. Not after what they did to my brother. Not after what they tried to do to me." Ethan swallowed hard, guilt twisting in his chest. He hadn't been the one who strung her up on that cursed tree, but he wore the same skin, and sometimes, in Ayoka's haunted eyes, he saw the ghosts of men she'd lost. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words stuck like dry dust in his throat. They reached the mesa by sundown, a sacred place where ancient petroglyphs carved into stone told stories older than memory. Tahoma stood waiting, tall and broad-shouldered, his face stern beneath a crown of raven-black hair streaked with gray. Around him, a half-dozen Apache warriors stood silent, their bows slung, their expressions unreadable. "You brought him?" Tahoma's deep voice carried the weight of disapproval as his dark eyes fixed on Ethan. "He saved me," Ayoka answered firmly before Ethan could speak. "Without him, I would be dead." For a long moment, Tahoma said nothing, only studied. Ethan with the stillness of a predator deciding whether to strike. Finally, he gave a single nod. "Then he may stand among us. But know this, white man, if you betray us, I will be the one to hang you." Ethan met his gaze without flinching. Fair enough. As night fell, they gathered around a low burning fire, the flames licking the desert wind. The Apache warriors murmured among themselves while Ayoka translated, her soft voice weaving the words of 2 worlds into one fragile thread. Tahoma spoke of the settlers' constant encroachment, land stolen, sacred hunting grounds burned, treaties broken like dry twigs. He told stories of Apache children who had vanished, of warriors shot for crossing invisible lines on soil that had once been theirs. Ethan listened, feeling the weight of their anger, their grief. He knew some of the settlers, too, hard-working families who simply wanted to survive, men who had bled carving homes out of wilderness. But sitting here among the Apache, seeing their faces lit by firelight, he couldn't deny their pain. The more he heard, the more he felt the world was splitting into pieces too sharp to mend. When his turn came, Ethan told his truth. He spoke of Deadwood Creek, of men sharpening blades and loading rifles, of a militia forming under a drunken foreman named Jed Mathers who hated Apaches with a burning vengeance. "They think y'all were behind the barn fire," Ethan said. Quietly, "They're itching to ride out at dawn and finish what they started years ago." At that, a ripple of murmurs moved through the warriors. Tahoma's jaw tightened, his hand resting near the knife on his belt. "Then May will meet." "Death," he said simply, but Ayoka leaned forward, her small hands gripping her uncle's arm. "No, uncle, there is another way. We cannot fight them all. More soldiers will come, more blood will spill. I do not want more dead brothers. We need to make them listen." Her voice trembled with a mixture of courage and desperation, and Ethan felt something shift in the circle. For the first time since he'd met her, Ayoka's strength shone brighter than her fear. Tahoma hesitated, his gaze softening just a fraction as he looked at his niece, the last living piece of his sister's bloodline. "Then you will speak for us," he said finally. "At dawn, you and the white man will ride to Deadwood Creek. You will carry our words. But know this, Ayoka, if they turn their guns on you, we will answer with fire and arrows. We will burn their town to the ground." The weight of his words settled over Ethan like the desert heat. He glanced at Ayoka, who gave him a small nod. They both knew what tomorrow would bring, the chance for peace or the spark for war. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat on the edge of the mesa, staring at the blanket of stars while coyotes howled somewhere far below. His thoughts were a tangled mess of past regrets and future fears. He thought of his own parents, killed by outlaws when he was barely 20. He thought of the settlers back in Deadwood Creek, so terrified they'd forgotten how to see anything but enemies. And he thought of Ayoka, who had somehow become the fragile thread holding two worlds together. When dawn painted the desert in hues of amber and rose, Ethan and Ayoka mounted their horses. As they rode toward Deadwood Creek, Ethan caught her eye. "You sure about this?" he asked. Her gaze was steady, her voice soft but unyielding. "If we do not try, Ethan Cole, no one ever will." And so they rode on, the weight of two nations on their shoulders, toward a town where rifles waited behind shuttered windows and hatred hung as thick as smoke. Somewhere behind them, on the mesa, Tahoma and his warriors stood ready, a silent promise that if the settlers refused to listen, the desert would soon drink deep of blood. The path ahead was carved in uncertainty, the line between peace and war so thin it might shatter with a single wrong word, a single pulled trigger. Ethan knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The first light of dawn painted the horizon in streaks of amber and crimson, the soft whistle of the wind carrying whispers through the open plains. Jacob's worn boots crunched softly on the dry earth as he walked to the edge of the ridge overlooking Shadow Creek, the very place where this bloody trail had begun. The landscape below was quiet now, almost deceptively peaceful, but the rancher's mind was far from calm. The weight of all that had happened, the ambush, the betrayal, the long nights filled with danger settled over his shoulders like a mantle of stone. Beside him, Ayanna stood silent, her dark hair braided with feathers that fluttered gently in the breeze. Her face carried a strength carved from pain, survival, and newfound hope, but her amber eyes remained troubled. In the valley below, her people, the small group of Apache survivors who had escaped the massacre, were setting up temporary shelters near the creek. Children laughed faintly in the distance, but every sound was tinged with grief, as if even their joy was afraid to be heard too loudly. "You think they'll come?" Jacob finally asked, his voice a low rumble. "They will," Ayana replied softly, her gaze fixed on the far-off hills. Men like McGraw don't forgive, and neither do they forget. Sheriff Elias McGraw. The name alone made Jacob's jaw clench. Once, McGraw had been a simple lawman. But greed, politics, and his hatred of the Apache had twisted him into something darker. He had orchestrated the massacre that killed Ayana's family and left her hanging from that tree with a sign meant to send a message: "White man don't forgive." Now, with his power consolidated and bounty hunters at his command, McGraw was the greatest threat to their survival. The day stretched thin as Jacob and Ayana prepared Shadow Creek for what was coming. Makeshift barricades of rock and timber were reinforced along the creekside, while Jacob taught the younger Apache boys how to reload rifles and sight targets. They had few weapons and fewer bullets, but determination burned hotter than fear in their hearts. Ayana, meanwhile, worked with the Apache women to create diversions and trap spits covered with brush, sharpened stakes hidden in the undergrowth, and signals made of smoke that could summon allies from nearby camps. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in blood-red hues, Jacob paused beside his horse, Dusty, running a hand along the old gelding's mane. "I can't ask you to stay, Ayana," he said quietly, turning to face her. "This fight isn't yours anymore. You've done enough." Ayana met his gaze with steady defiance. "It is mine. You saved me, Jacob, and you gave me a chance to fight back. If we leave now, McGraw wins. My people's blood will have been spilled for nothing." Jacob nodded, though a lump formed in his throat. He'd known she would say that. In Ayana, he'd seen the quiet strength of the land itself, unyielding, resilient, unbroken despite all it had endured. He couldn't deny that he had come to care for her more deeply than he ever thought possible. That night, as the stars burned fiercely above, the campfire crackled, throwing shadows across faces lined with resolve. Old Chief Dakota, Ayana's uncle and one of the few remaining elders, told stories of their ancestors, of warriors who fought with honor and spirits that walked alongside them in battle. His voice, raspy yet commanding, carried across the quiet night. "Tonight, we stand as one," Dakota said, his gaze shifting between Jacob and the Apache warriors. "White man or Apache, this land has seen enough blood. But if McGraw wants to bring war to Shadow Creek, then the spirits will see who truly owns this earth." Jacob sat silently, sharpening his knife as Dakota spoke, his heart pounding like a drum. For the first time in years, he felt something stir within him, a sense of belonging, of purpose. He wasn't just a lonely rancher anymore. He was part of something greater. Just before dawn, a soft mist rolled in from the hills, blurring the edges of the creek and cloaking their defenses in an eerie haze. It was then that Ayana spotted movement in the distance, silhouettes on horseback glinting in the pale light. McGraw's men had arrived. Jacob took his position at the barricade, rifle steady in his hands. Dusty stood tethered nearby, ears twitching nervously. "Remember," he called out to the small group of defenders, "don't waste your bullets. Make every shot count." McGraw's posse rode down like a storm of fury, 24 hardened gunslingers, their faces half hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats and their rifles ready. At the front rode McGraw himself, his cold, calculating eyes fixed on Jacob. "You picked the wrong side, rancher," McGraw shouted, his voice echoing through the valley. "Hand over the girl and walk away, and maybe I'll let you live." Jacob's jaw tightened. He stepped forward, planting his boots firmly in the dirt. "Ayana stays," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. "And this land stays free." McGraw's lips curled into a sneer. "So be it." The first shot cracked like thunder, shattering the silence of the creek. The battle erupted in a maelstrom of gunfire, smoke, and chaos. Bullets tore through the mist, splintering wood and ricocheting off stone. Jacob fired with deadly precision, dropping one rider, then another, but for every man that fell, two more seemed to take their place. Ayanna darted between cover, loosing arrows with uncanny accuracy, each strike finding its mark. The Apache warriors fought like ghosts in the mist, silent and swift, disappearing into the fog only to reappear with steel flashing in their hands. Despite their courage, the defenders were outnumbered and outgunned. Jacob knew they couldn't hold forever. He spotted McGraw moving through the chaos, his rifle trained directly on Ayanna. Time seemed to slow as Jacob raised his own weapon, his finger tightening on the trigger. The shot rang out. McGraw's hat flew from his head as the bullet grazed his temple, but he didn't fall. Instead, he turned his fury on Jacob, spurring his horse forward. The two men collided with bone-jarring force, tumbling into the dirt as their weapons scattered. Fists flew. Boots kicked, and dust choked the air as Jacob and McGraw grappled, each blow fueled by years of hatred and vengeance. McGraw was stronger, but Jacob fought like a man with nothing left to lose. At last, with a final desperate surge, Jacob drove his knife into the earth beside McGraw's throat. "Call off your men," Jacob growled, sweat and blood streaking his face. "Now," McGraw hesitated, his pride warring with the reality of the blade pressing against his skin. Finally, he raised his hand, signaling his men to stand down. The gunfire faded, leaving only the ragged breaths of the wounded and dying. The mist began to lift, revealing the cost of the battle. Several Apache warriors lay still on the ground, their lifeless forms covered gently by their kin. Ayanna knelt beside one of the fallen, her face etched with sorrow but also defiance. McGraw spat into the dirt, his hatred burning even brighter now. "This ain't over, rancher," he snarled before mounting his horse and retreating with the remnants of his posse. Jacob watched him go, knowing deep in his bones that McGraw meant every word. The fight for Shadow Creek wasn't finished, not yet. But for now, they had won a fragile, fleeting victory. As the sun climbed higher, its golden light spilled across the blood-stained earth, and for the first time in days, Jacob allowed himself to breathe. He turned to Ayanna, who stood beside him, her bow still in hand. "You did good," he said softly. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "We survived," she whispered, "for now." Jacob nodded, his eyes drifting toward the distant hills. The next storm was coming, and when it arrived, he and Ayanna would be ready. The cold wind swept through the vast open plains as the early dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson. The air was heavy with tension, carrying with it the scent of burned wood and blood from the previous night's ambush. Jacob Walker, the once lonely rancher whose quiet life had been shattered and reshaped, stood atop a small rise overlooking the Apache village that lay nestled beneath a ring of sandstone cliffs. His worn leather duster flapped against his legs, and his rifle rested across his shoulder, but his piercing blue eyes were fixed on the smoke curling upward from the distant campfires. Behind him, Tala stood silently, her dark braids swaying with the wind, her amber eyes reflecting both fear and determination. She had always been strong, stronger than he thought any 16-year-old girl could be, but today was different. Today would decide the fate of everything: the ranch, the Apache people, and the fragile bond that had formed between her and Jacob. The previous night had been chaos. After rescuing Tala from the brutal punishment of her tribe's elders, those who had hung her from a tree with a sign declaring, "White man don't forgive," Jacob had tried to negotiate peace. But greed had poisoned the hearts of men on both sides. A ruthless group of white bounty hunters had tracked them, determined to wipe out the Apache and claim their land, while a splinter group within the Apache camp wanted revenge for generations of suffering. When the first shot rang out beneath the blood-red sunset, everything descended into violence. Fires blazed, bullets screamed, and the cries of the wounded echoed into the darkness. But somehow Jacob, Tala, and the few who wanted peace had survived. Now at dawn the war wasn't over. It was just beginning. Jacob clenched his jaw and whispered to himself, "One last fight, Walker, just one more." He turned to Tala, his weathered face softened by her presence. "You don't have to come with me," he said quietly, his deep voice carrying a kind of gentleness he rarely showed. But Tala shook her head firmly, her small hand gripping the knife at her belt. "No," she replied in her soft Apache accent. "This is my fight too. If we do not stop them now, there will be no home for anyone." Her words carried the weight of her people's pain, and Jacob knew she was right. Together, they descended into the canyon where the Apache elders had gathered with what remained of their warriors. Faces were grim, streaked with soot and blood, and the air buzzed with distrust. Old Chief Nahali, Tala's grandfather, stood leaning on his carved wooden staff, his weathered eyes sharp as flint. He looked at Jacob with an expression that mixed bitterness and reluctant respect. "White man," he said slowly, his voice deep and rasping, "you came into our lands, you saved my granddaughter, but you bring trouble like a storm." Jacob met his gaze without flinching. "I didn't bring the trouble," he replied steadily, "but I'm here to end it, for both of us." Nahali's silence lasted a long moment before he nodded slightly. "Then you will fight with us." It wasn't a question. Jacob nodded once, gripping his rifle tighter. The plan was simple. The bounty hunters, led by the vicious mercenary Ethan Crow, would be coming at sunrise, riding hard to wipe out what was left of the Apache and burn Jacob's ranch to the ground. If they weren't stopped here and now, there would be no peace left for miles in any direction. When the sun crested the horizon, the rumble of hooves broke the silence. Ethan Crow's men appeared, a dark line of riders against the rising light. Dust billowed behind them as their rifles glinted ominously. Crow himself, a towering figure with a scar running down the side of his jaw, rode at the front, his cold eyes scanning the canyon below. "I see you got yourself some friends, Walker," he called out mockingly when he spotted Jacob standing beside the Apache warriors. "But it won't save you. This land ain't theirs anymore, and it sure as hell ain't yours." Jacob stepped forward, his voice carrying over the canyon. "Turn around, Crow. Go back. No more killing." But Crow just laughed, a harsh, hollow sound. "You think I'm leaving without my payday?" He raised his hand and gave the signal. The first gunshots cracked like thunder, and the battle erupted. Bullets whizzed past as Jacob dropped behind a boulder, returning fire with calm precision. Tala crouched beside him, reloading as fast as she could, her small hand steady despite the chaos. Apache warriors shouted their battle cries, arrows flying through the dust-filled air, while Crow's men pressed forward relentlessly. Jacob fought like a man possessed, driven not by hatred but by something deeper, the need to protect the fragile hope he and Tala had built. Then came the moment everything turned. Ethan Crow charged straight for them, his revolver raised, fury twisting his scarred face. Jacob stepped out from cover, his boots grinding into the rocky soil, and aimed his rifle. "This ends now," he growled. Crow fired first. The bullet grazed Jacob's shoulder, but he didn't falter. He squeezed the trigger, and Crow's horse reared violently as the man toppled into the dust. UNMOVING. The bounty hunters hesitated, their leader down, and in that pause, the Apache warriors surged forward. Within minutes, the attackers were overwhelmed, retreating into the hills, leaving their dead and wounded behind. Silence fell over the canyon, broken only by the crackling of dying fires and the ragged breaths of the survivors. Jacob sank to his knees, blood staining his sleeve, and felt Tala's hand on his arm. "It is over," she whispered, her voice trembling. He looked into her eyes, searching for any sign of fear, but found only strength. "For now," he said softly, "but we'll have to rebuild. Together." Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the world in shades of amber and violet, Jacob stood outside his small ranch house, now partially burned but still standing. The Apache elders arrived, including Chief Nahali, who placed a hand on Jacob's shoulder. "You have fought for us," the old man said gravely, "and we will fight for you. This land will be shared, not stolen." For the first time in his life, Jacob felt the weight of loneliness lift. The girl he had found hanging from a tree, marked for death by her own people and mistrusted by his, had become the bridge between two worlds. And though the scars of the past could not be erased, there was hope now, fragile but real, like the first bloom of wildflowers after a storm. As the stars blanketed the sky, Tala joined him on the porch, her soft voice breaking the silence. "Do you think they will forgive someday?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the endless plains. Jacob glanced at her and smiled faintly, the lines around his eyes softening. "Maybe," he said. "But even if they don't, we'll make something worth forgiving." And so, beneath the quiet western night, a new chapter began, one written not in vengeance, but in survival, courage, and an unexpected bond between a lonely rancher and a young Apache girl who refused to be broken. The land would remember their fight, but so would the people. For the first time in decades, there was a chance for peace. Subscribe to Love Under Western Skies. Also comment down below.